I hadn't been home in 3 years. The realization hit me as I pulled into the driveway of my childhood house, the gravel crunching beneath my rental car's tires like a familiar greeting. 3 years since I'd seen this wraparound porch. 3 years since I'd walked through that front door without the weight of unspoken words hanging between my family and me. The magnolia tree by the mailbox had grown taller, its branches now brushing against the second-story window of what used to be my bedroom. Everything looked smaller than I remembered, the way childhood homes always do when you've spent years living in cramped city apartments where every square foot costs a fortune. But there was something else too, a sense of returning to a version of myself I'd deliberately left behind when I moved to Seattle. The version who smiled too little, who kept his thoughts carefully locked away, who never quite fit into the shape his family expected him to fill. My sister Emma was getting married in 2 days, 26 years old and glowing with the kind of happiness that seemed to radiate from her pores. She'd called me 6 months ago with the news, her voice crackling through the phone connection, practically vibrating with excitement as she told me about David, about the ring, about the garden ceremony she'd been dreaming of since she was 12. "You have to come, Marcus," she'd said, and there was something in her voice, a plea wrapped in certainty, that made it impossible to say no. I can't get married without my big brother there, so here I was, back in Millbrook, North Carolina, population 8,000, where everyone knew everyone and secrets had a way of spreading like kudzu. My parents had been cautiously warm during our phone conversations leading up to this weekend, the kind of careful politeness that meant they were trying but still didn't quite know how to talk to their son who'd moved across the country and rarely called. I grabbed my weekend bag from the trunk and walked toward the house, noting the new coat of white paint on the shutters, the hanging baskets of petunias my mother had probably spent hours arranging. The front door opened before I could reach for the handle. "Marcus!" Emma launched herself at me with the same enthusiasm she'd had as a kid, nearly knocking me backward with the force of her hug. She smelled like vanilla and excitement. Her auburn hair, the same shade as mine, but longer, prettier, catching the afternoon sunlight. "God, you're skinny," she said, pulling back to look at me with sisterly concern. "Are you eating enough? Seattle must be feeding you nothing but coffee and rain." "I'm fine," I laughed, though I could see her point. 3 years of working 60-hour weeks as a software developer had left me leaner than I'd been in high school, my shoulders a little too sharp beneath my t-shirt. "You look incredible. Marriage suits you already." She beamed, practically glowing as she tugged me inside. The house smelled exactly the same, lemon furniture polish and my mother's lavender sachets with an undertone of the vanilla candles she burned obsessively. Family photos lined the hallway, a chronological journey from Emma's birth to my high school graduation, where they mysteriously stopped updating. My parents had never quite known how to display pictures of a son who'd grown distant, who visited for Christmas and Easter and always seemed to be counting the hours until he could leave again. "Mom's in the kitchen having a minor breakdown about the catering," Emma said, leading me through the familiar maze of rooms. "Dad's hiding in his workshop pretending to fix something that isn't broken. You know, typical pre-wedding family dynamics." I could hear my mother's voice before I saw her, that particular tone she got when she was trying to solve a problem through sheer force of will. She was standing at the kitchen island with her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing wildly at a stack of vendor contracts. "No, I specifically said the lavender napkins, not the lilac ones. Lavender, Lavender." Emma rolled her eyes and mouthed "napkin crisis" at me. Our mother looked up mid-sentence and her expression shifted from harried vendor wrangling to genuine joy. "I have to call you back," she said into the phone, hanging up before the vendor could respond. "Marcus, honey, you made it." Her hug was softer than Emma's, but no less genuine, the kind of embrace that carried years of complicated love. Margaret Whitman had always been a woman who expressed affection through action. Elaborate holiday meals, hand-knitted scarves sent in care packages, worried phone calls about whether I was sleeping enough. Physical affection had never come easily to her, but she was trying, and I could feel the effort in the way she held on just a beat longer than usual. "You look good, sweetheart," she said, though I caught the same concern Emma had shown. Tired, but good. Thanks, Mom. The house looks great. You've been busy. She flushed with pleasure, launching into a detailed explanation of all the preparation she'd been overseeing for the past 6 months. Emma's wedding was happening here, in the garden she'd spent decades cultivating, with a reception on the back lawn under string lights and a tent that would be delivered tomorrow morning. It was the kind of intimate, personal celebration that suited Emma perfectly, and I could see how much work my mother had put into making it special. The photographer should be here soon to scout locations, she said, consulting her phone for the schedule she'd probably memorized by now. Emma found him through a friend in Charlotte, supposed to be very good, very artistic, Daniel something. Daniel Chen, Emma corrected. And his work is gorgeous, Marcus. You should see his portfolio. He does this thing where he captures these quiet, intimate moments that feel like paintings. I knew the second I saw his photos that he was the one. I nodded, only half listening as they continued discussing logistics. My attention was already drifting toward the French doors that led to the garden, where I could see the space that would become Emma's wedding venue in 2 days. The afternoon light was golden, filtering through the oak trees that had stood in this yard since before I was born. It looked peaceful, romantic, everything Emma had probably dreamed it would be. "Why don't you go get settled?" my mother suggested. "Your room is ready." Emma had me take down some of those old baseball posters, but I left the important stuff. My childhood bedroom was a time capsule I wasn't sure I was ready to open, but I nodded anyway. "Sounds good. I'll just grab some air first." I stepped out into the garden, letting the late afternoon warmth settle over me like a familiar blanket. This had always been my favorite part of the property, the section of yard where my mother's careful planning gave way to something more wild and natural. Ancient oak trees created a canopy overhead, their branches thick enough to hold the treehouse my father had built when Emma and I were kids. Below, carefully tended flower beds bloomed with late summer color, purple coneflowers, black-eyed Susans, the climbing roses that had been here since before we moved in. It was quiet except for the distant hum of cicadas and the sound of a lawnmower from somewhere down the street. I could picture Emma walking down the gravel path between the flower beds, David waiting for her under the largest oak tree where they'd set up the ceremony space. It would be beautiful. It would be everything she wanted. I was so lost in imagining the scene that I didn't hear the footsteps on the gravel until a voice behind me said, "You must be the brother." I turned, and the first thing I noticed was his smile. Easy, confident, the kind of expression that suggested he was genuinely pleased to meet me rather than just being polite. He was Asian American, probably around my age, with black hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. There was a camera hanging around his neck, something expensive and professional looking, and he moved with the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested he was comfortable anywhere. "Marcus," I said, extending my hand. "And you must be Daniel." His handshake was firm, his skin warm from the afternoon sun. "Daniel Chen, your sister's told me a lot about you." "All good things, I hope." "She mentioned you're some kind of tech genius who abandoned us all for the Pacific Northwest." His tone was light, teasing without being presumptuous. "Can't say I blame you. I spent 2 years in Portland before I moved back south. There's something addictive about all that rain and coffee." Guilty as charged on both counts. I found myself smiling more easily than I had in months. Though I'm not sure I'd call myself a genius, more like a recovering workaholic who writes code for a living. "Same difference, right?" He grinned, then gestured toward the garden around us. "This is incredible, by the way. Your mom's created something really special here. I've been walking around for the past 20 minutes trying to figure out the best angles for Saturday." I looked around the garden with fresh eyes, seeing it the way a photographer might. The late afternoon light filtering through the trees, creating patterns of shadow and illumination on the grass. The way the flower beds curved naturally along the path, leading the eye toward the ceremony space. The old garden gate covered in climbing jasmine that would make a perfect backdrop for portraits. "She's been working on this place for 20 years, I said. "It's her masterpiece." "I can tell, gardens like this don't happen by accident." He raised his camera, not pointing it at anything specific, just holding it ready. "Mind if I take a few test shots while we talk?" I like to get a feel for how the light moves through a space. Go ahead. He started moving around the garden, not in any hurry, just observing. His camera stayed lowered, but I could see him mentally cataloging angles and compositions. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked, like he was having a quiet conversation with the space around him. Emma says you haven't been home in a while, he said, pausing near the rose trellis to adjust his camera settings. 3 years. The admission felt heavier than it should have. Work keeps me pretty busy. That's a long time. There was no judgment in his voice, just observation, but something about the way he said it made me look at him more carefully. He was focusing on his camera, giving me space to respond or not as I chose. Yeah, it is. I found myself being more honest than I'd intended. Family gatherings can be complicated. He nodded like he understood something about complicated families. Well, you picked a good one to come back for. Emma's incredible. She spent an hour showing me pictures of flowers and explaining why each one mattered. Most brides just want everything to look pretty, but she actually cares about the story she's telling. That sounds like Emma. She's always been thoughtful like that. Takes after her big brother, maybe? I laughed, caught off guard by the assumption. I think you've got that backward. Emma's the thoughtful one. I'm just the one who overthinks everything. There's a difference? Before I could answer, he raised his camera and fired off a quick shot. Not of the garden or the light, but of me, caught mid-laugh with my guard down. The sound of the shutter seemed louder than it should have in the quiet afternoon. Sorry, he said, lowering the camera with a slightly sheepish expression. Force of habit. You have a good laugh. There was something about the way he said it, casual but warm, like he'd been thinking about my laugh for longer than the few seconds since it happened. Heat crept up my neck and I found myself looking away toward the house. I should probably go get settled, I said. Let you do your thing. Actually, would you mind staying for a few more minutes? I could use a hand with something. I turned back to find him pulling a small reflector out of his camera bag, the kind photographers use to bounce light around. He was looking at me with an expression that seemed perfectly professional, but there was something underneath it, a request that felt more personal than it should have. I want to test how the light falls on people, not just the scenery, he explained. Would you mind standing over by the ceremony space, just so I can see how the shadows work? It was a reasonable request, the kind of thing any photographer might ask. But as I walked over to where he'd indicated, a spot under the largest oak tree where Emma and David would stand in 2 days, I felt oddly self-conscious, aware of his eyes on me in a way that had nothing to do with photography. Perfect, he said, raising his camera. Just relax. Look natural. Look natural, as if there was anything natural about standing in my sister's wedding venue while a man I'd met 10 minutes ago studied me through a camera lens. I tried to find a comfortable position, settling my weight on one foot, letting my hands fall to my sides. That's good, but he lowered the camera, frowning slightly. Your shoulders are a little tense. Mind if I... He approached slowly, giving me plenty of time to object. When I didn't, he reached out and placed his hands lightly on my shoulders, adjusting my posture with a kind of casual confidence that suggested he did this all the time with his subjects. His touch was warm through my t-shirt, his fingers gentle but sure as he squared my shoulders and tilted my head slightly to catch the light. He was close enough that I could smell his cologne, something clean and understated, and see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. There, he said softly, his hands lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. That's better. He stepped back and raised his camera again, but something in the air between us had shifted. The afternoon felt warmer, more charged, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the very molecules seemed to vibrate with potential energy. Good, he murmured, taking several shots in quick succession. Really good. The light loves you. I stood there trying to look natural while acutely aware of every breath, every micro-expression that might be captured through his lens. There was something almost intimate about being photographed this way. Not the stiff formal portraits I remembered from high school, but something that felt more like being seen. You're a natural at this, he said, finally lowering the camera. Have you ever modeled? I laughed, probably too loud. Definitely not. I spend most of my time staring at computer screens, not being stared at. Well, the camera likes you. He moved closer to show me the back of his camera, scrolling through the shots he'd just taken. See? Look at that light on your face. He was standing next to me now, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, his shoulder barely brushing mine as he held the camera between us. On the small screen, I saw myself through his eyes, relaxed, natural, caught in a moment of genuine expression I hadn't even realized I was having. "That's really good," I said, surprised by how comfortable I looked. "You're talented." "It's not about talent," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's about seeing what's already there." We stood there for a moment, looking at the images, our heads closer together than strictly necessary. I could feel his breath on my shoulder, could see the concentration on his face as he scrolled through the shots. There was something about the way he worked, focused but relaxed, professional but personal, that made me want to understand how he saw the world. "Daniel, there you are!" Emma's voice carried across the garden, breaking the spell that had settled over us. We stepped apart quickly, though there was no reason to feel guilty about looking at photographs. "I was wondering if you'd gotten lost," she said, approaching with 2 glasses of iced tea. "How's the light looking?" "Perfect," Daniel said, his voice back to its earlier professional warmth. "This space is going to be incredible on Saturday. Your brother was helping me test some angles." "Marcus is very helpful," Emma said, giving me a look that suggested she'd noticed something but wasn't sure what. "Though he's probably dying to get out of the heat. He's gone soft living in Seattle." "I'm fine," I protested, though I realized I was sweating slightly and not entirely from the temperature. "Here, take this." She handed me one of the glasses. "Mom made fresh tea. She's been stress cooking since Tuesday." The tea was sweet and cold, exactly the way my mother had been making it for 30 years. I drank half of it in one gulp, grateful for something to do with my hands. "I should let you get back to work," I told Daniel. "Thanks for the impromptu photo session." "Thank you for the help. I'll probably be out here for another hour or so if you want to see more of the setup later." There was nothing particularly loaded about the invitation, but something in his tone made it feel like more than professional courtesy. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything that wouldn't sound awkward. "I'll leave you to it then," I said. "See you around." I walked back toward the house with Emma, trying to ignore the feeling that Daniel's eyes were still on me, trying to ignore the way my skin still felt warm where his hands had touched my shoulders. "He seems nice," Emma said as we reached the French doors. "Yeah, very professional." She gave me another one of those looks, the kind that suggested my little sister could read me better than I'd like to admit. Professional, right. What's that supposed to mean? "Nothing," she said, but she was smiling. "Just, he was looking at you like you were more than just a test subject." Heat flooded my cheeks. "You're imagining things." "Maybe." She opened the door and gestured for me to go ahead of her. "But I don't think so, and for what it's worth, you were looking back." I didn't have an answer for that, so I pretended I hadn't heard her and escaped upstairs to my childhood bedroom. The room was exactly as my mother had described. The baseball posters gone, but everything else preserved like a museum exhibit of my teenage years. My desk still held the same collection of sci-fi novels I'd been obsessed with in high school. The bulletin board above it was covered with faded concert tickets and photos of friends I barely talked to anymore. I sat on the edge of the bed that felt too small for my adult body and tried to process what had just happened in the garden. It was nothing, really. A photographer doing his job, a brief moment of professional necessity when he'd adjusted my posture. The kind of casual interaction that happened 1,000 times a day without meaning anything. Except it hadn't felt casual. It had felt like something else entirely. A recognition, maybe, or the beginning of one. The way he'd looked at me through the camera lens, the extra beat, his hands had lingered on my shoulders, the quiet intensity in his voice when he'd said the light loved me. I was being ridiculous, reading meaning into perfectly innocent interactions because I'd been living alone in Seattle for 3 years, because I worked too much and dated too little, because coming home always made me revert to the uncertain, overthinking version of myself I'd been in high school. But as I unpacked my weekend bag, I couldn't stop thinking about the warmth of his touch or the way he'd smiled when he saw me laugh. Couldn't stop wondering what he'd seen through that camera lens that had made him look at me like I was worth capturing. From my window, I could see him still moving through the garden below, photographing angles and testing light. Occasionally, he'd pause and look up at the house, and I found myself stepping back from the window, worried he might catch me watching. This was going to be a long weekend. The next morning, I woke to the sound of chaos downstairs. Voices overlapping, the front door opening and closing repeatedly, someone moving furniture across the hardwood floors. Emma's wedding day -1, and it sounded like an army had invaded our house. I pulled on jeans and a t-shirt and headed downstairs to find controlled pandemonium. The catering staff had arrived early to prep in the kitchen. The florist was arranging centerpieces on the dining room table. My father was carrying folding chairs from his workshop to the backyard, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else but knowing better than to complain within earshot of my mother. "Marcus," my mother spotted me from across the kitchen where she was orchestrating the breakfast setup with military precision. "Perfect timing. Can you help your father with the chairs? The rental company delivered them to the wrong side of the house." I grabbed a cup of coffee strong enough to wake the dead and headed outside. My father was methodically loading chairs into a wheelbarrow, his movements efficient despite his 62 years. Robert Whitman had always been a man of few words, more comfortable expressing himself through action than conversation. "Morning, Dad." "Marcus," he nodded toward a stack of chairs. "Take the other end of the wheelbarrow." We worked in comfortable silence, the kind that had developed between us over the years when we'd run out of easy things to talk about. My father had never quite known what to make of his son who preferred books to baseball, computers to carpentry, who'd moved across the country and called home less than he probably should. But he'd never been unkind about it, just puzzled in the gentle way of a man who loved his children but didn't always understand them. "Emma's excited," he said as we unloaded chairs near the ceremony space. "She should be. This is going to be beautiful." He paused in his work to look around the garden with the same pride I'd seen in my mother's face. "Your mom's been planning this for months, driving me crazy with fabric samples and flower arrangements, but," he shrugged, "it makes her happy. And Emma. Emma, too." He lifted another chair from the wheelbarrow. "She asked me if I thought you were doing okay." The comment caught me off guard. "What did you tell her?" "Told her you looked thin but healthy, tired maybe. Working too hard, probably." He glanced at me sideways. "Same as always." There was no criticism in his voice, just observation tinged with the kind of parental concern that never fully goes away. I realized that my family had been worried about me, not just because I lived far away, but because I'd let work consume me to the point where I'd forgotten how to be present in my own life. "I'm fine, Dad, really." "I know you are, but fine and happy aren't always the same thing." Before I could figure out how to respond to that unexpectedly perceptive comment, a familiar voice called out from the garden gate. "Morning, hope I'm not interrupting." Daniel appeared with his camera and a large equipment bag, looking like he'd been up for hours despite the early time. He was wearing dark jeans and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, somehow managing to look both professional and casually elegant. "Daniel," my father said, straightening up with the kind of automatic politeness he reserved for wedding vendors. "Right on time." "I wanted to get some shots of the setup process," Daniel explained. "There's something beautiful about the transformation, seeing a space become what it's meant to be." He was already scanning the garden with that photographer's eye, noting how the morning light fell differently than it had the evening before, softer, more golden, with mist still clinging to the grass and the shadowy spots. "We'll stay out of your way," my father said, but Daniel waved him off. "Actually, I'd love to get some candid shots of the family preparing. The behind-the-scenes moments are often the most meaningful ones. Would you mind?" My father looked uncomfortable. He'd never been one for having his picture taken, but he nodded reluctantly. "I suppose that's what we're paying you for." Daniel's camera was already in his hands, and he began moving around us as we continued setting up chairs. His presence was unobtrusive, almost invisible, but I was acutely aware of him, aware of when he was focusing on my father's methodical work, when he was capturing the overall scene, and especially aware of when his lens turned toward me. It was different from yesterday's deliberate posing session. This felt more natural, like being observed rather than photographed. But every time I caught him looking at me through the viewfinder, I felt that same flutter of self-consciousness mixed with something that might have been anticipation. "Marcus, can you grab that end?" my father asked, indicating a table that needed to be moved into position. As we lifted it together, I heard the rapid click of Daniel's camera capturing the moment. When we set the table down, he was already moving to a different angle, photographing the way the morning light fell through the oak branches. "You're good at this," I told him during a brief lull while my father went to get more chairs. "Thanks. I've always been drawn to documentary-style work, the unguarded moments when people forget they're being photographed. Must take a lot of patience." "Sometimes, but it's worth it when you catch something real." He adjusted his camera settings, not looking at me directly. "Like yesterday when you laughed. That wasn't a posed expression. That was just you." The comment sent warmth spreading through my chest. There was something about the way he talked about his work, passionate but not pretentious, focused on connection rather than just technique, that made me want to understand more about how he saw the world. "Have you always been a photographer?" "Since college, yeah. Started out doing it for fun, taking pictures at parties and events. Realized I was better at capturing other people's joy than creating my own." He paused, then added more quietly, "That probably sounds depressing." "Not depressing, just honest." He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment the rest of the activity around us seemed to fade into background noise. There was something in his expression, a recognition maybe of someone who understood what it felt like to observe life from a slight remove. "Marcus!" Emma's voice carried across the garden, breaking the moment. "Mom needs you inside." I glanced toward the house where I could see my sister waving from the French doors. When I looked back, Daniel had already returned his attention to his camera, checking something on the display screen. I gestured toward the house. "Of course. I'll be out here for a while if you want to see how things are looking later." There was that invitation again, casual but somehow loaded with possibility. I nodded and headed toward the house, aware that he was watching me go. The chaos inside had escalated. The florist was having a crisis about ribbon colors. The caterers needed to know where to set up the beverage station. My mother was in full command mode, directing traffic with the kind of organized efficiency that had kept our household running for 30 years. "There you are," she said, spotting me in the doorway. "Can you help move some furniture? We need to clear space in the living room for the gift table." I spent the next 2 hours being useful, moving chairs, helping arrange flowers, doing whatever small tasks my mother assigned with the distracted gratitude of a woman with 1,000 details to manage. It was oddly soothing, having clear, simple objectives that didn't require overthinking. Through it all, I found myself glancing out the windows, catching glimpses of Daniel working in the garden. He moved through the space like he belonged there, photographing details I never would have noticed. The way morning dew caught on a spider's web, the pattern shadows made on the gravel path, the careful arrangement of chairs that would soon be filled with wedding guests. Around mid-morning, Emma found me arranging programs on the hall table. "You've been helpful," she said, settling beside me with her own cup of coffee. "Mom's practically glowing with appreciation." "It's the least I can do. This is a lot of work." "Yeah, but it's good work, the kind that matters." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I'm glad you're here, Marcus. Really glad." There was something in her voice that made me look at her more carefully. Emma had always been the more emotionally articulate of the two of us, but there was a weight to her words that suggested she'd been thinking about this conversation. "Of course I'm here. I wouldn't miss your wedding." "I know, but I also know it's complicated for you being home. It has been for a while." I kept my eyes on the programs I was straightening, not sure how to respond. Emma and I had always been close, but we'd never talked directly about why I distanced myself from the family, why my visits had become shorter and less frequent over the years. "It's not that I don't want to be here," I said finally. "It's just different now," she supplied when I trailed off. You're different now. We're all different. Yeah. But different doesn't have to mean distant. She touched my arm gently. I miss talking to you, Marcus. Really talking, not just the polite catch-up calls we've been doing. Her words hit harder than I'd expected. I realized that in my effort to avoid the complicated parts of coming home, I'd also been avoiding the good parts, the easy intimacy with Emma, the comfort of being somewhere I was known and loved, the simple pleasure of being useful to people who mattered to me. I miss that too, I admitted. Good. She smiled, the same bright expression she'd had since we were kids. So maybe we can work on that this weekend, in between all the wedding madness? I'd like that. Perfect. And speaking of working on things, she glanced toward the window where Daniel was visible in the distance. The photographer seems nice. Heat rose in my cheeks. We already had this conversation yesterday. No, yesterday I mentioned that he was looking at you. Today I'm saying he seems like the kind of person worth getting to know. Emma. What? I'm just making an observation. He's talented, he's charming, he clearly has good taste in subjects. She grinned at my expression. And he's single, in case you were wondering. I wasn't wondering. Sure you weren't. That's why you've been staring out of the window every 5 minutes. I had been doing that, and the fact that Emma had noticed made me realize I was being less subtle than I'd thought. It doesn't matter anyway. He's here to work. I'm here for your wedding. That's it. Okay, she said in the tone that meant she was humoring me. But you know, sometimes the best things happen when you're not looking for them, when you're just present, available to whatever wants to unfold. Before I could argue with her optimistic philosophy, my mother appeared in the doorway. Emma, honey, the florist needs to talk to you about the boutonnieres. And Marcus, would you mind checking on the garden setup? Make sure everything looks right? Emma gave me a meaningful look as she headed toward the dining room. Be present, she said quietly as she passed me. Available. I grabbed my coffee and headed outside, telling myself I was just being helpful. Checking on the setup had nothing to do with wanting to see Daniel again, wanting to continue the conversation we'd started earlier. The garden had been transformed in the few hours I'd been inside. Chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the oak tree where Emma and David would take their vows. White ribbon marked the aisle between them. The altar area was decorated with arrangements of white roses and greenery that somehow looked both elegant and natural. It was beautiful. More than that, it looked like Emma, romantic but not fussy, carefully planned but still organic and alive. What do you think? Daniel's voice came from behind me. I turned to find him standing near the garden gate, camera hanging around his neck, looking at the setup with the critical eye of someone whose job it was to make it look perfect in photographs. It's incredible, I said honestly. Emma's going to cry when she sees it. Good crying, I hope. Definitely good crying. She's been dreaming about this for months. He nodded, then gestured toward the ceremony space. Want to do a final walkthrough? I like to make sure I understand the flow of events before the actual day. We walked down the aisle together, him explaining where he planned to position himself during different parts of the ceremony, me listening and trying not to think about how comfortable this felt, moving through the space with him, being included in his creative process. I'll be here for the processional, he said, indicating a spot off to the side that would give him a clear view without being intrusive. Then move to the back for the vows, catch some reaction shots from the guests. Sounds like you've thought it through. I try to be prepared, though honestly the best shots usually happen when I'm not expecting them. He paused near the altar, looking around thoughtfully. Like yesterday when you laughed. I wasn't planning to photograph you at all, but something about that moment felt important to capture. There was something about the way he said it, important to capture, that made my pulse quicken. Like the moment had mattered to him in a way that went beyond professional interest. Can I ask you something? The question was out before I could stop myself. Sure. Yesterday, when you said the camera liked me, what did you mean by that? He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. When he spoke, his voice was more serious than I'd heard it before. Some people fight the camera. They try to control how they're seen, put up walls between themselves and the lens. Others just open up, let themselves be seen as they actually are. He looked at me directly, his dark eyes steady and warm. You're the second type. There's no artifice with you, no performance. That's rare. Or maybe I'm just not smart enough to know I should be performing. He laughed, but gently. Trust me, it's not about intelligence. It's about honesty, vulnerability. Some people spend their whole lives trying to learn how to do what you do naturally. We were standing close together now, the intimate space of the ceremony area making our conversation feel more personal than it had any right to. I could smell his cologne again, could see the flecks of gold in his eyes that I'd noticed yesterday. I should probably get back, I said, though I didn't move. Probably, he agreed, also not moving. We stood there for another moment, caught in that strange suspended space between wanting to stay and knowing we should leave, when the sound of a car door slamming in the distance broke the spell. I should really get back, I said, taking a step backward. Yeah, he said softly. Me too. But neither of us moved immediately. There was something unfinished in the air between us, a conversation that had started but hadn't reached its natural conclusion. Finally, he lifted his camera and took one last shot of the ceremony space, now empty but still beautiful in the afternoon light. See you tonight? He asked as we walked back toward the house together. At the reception. Yeah, I'll be there. Good. He smiled, and there was something in his expression that made the simple word feel like a promise. I watched him walk back to his car, noting the easy confidence in his stride, the way he handled his equipment with practiced care. As he drove away, I realized I was already looking forward to seeing him again in a few hours, already wondering what the evening might bring. Emma was right about one thing. I was definitely paying attention to the photographer. The question was what, if anything, I was going to do about it. Part 2. The reception was in full swing by the time I made it back outside. The late afternoon had given way to early evening, and string lights had been turned on throughout the garden, creating a warm, magical glow that transformed the familiar space into something from a fairy tale. The tent my mother had worried about for weeks was now filled with guests, the sound of conversation and laughter mixing with the gentle music from the small band Emma had hired. I'd spent the last few hours getting ready, which mostly involved staring at my reflection and wondering why I cared so much about how I looked. The navy suit I'd brought felt more formal than necessary for a backyard wedding, but Emma had requested that the family dress up, and I found myself taking extra care with details I usually ignored, making sure my shirt was pressed, that my hair looked deliberately tousled rather than accidentally messy. Now, standing at the edge of the reception area with a glass of wine in my hand, I felt overdressed and underprepared for whatever the evening might bring. You clean up nice. I turned to find Daniel approaching from the direction of the house, and for a moment I forgot how to form words. He'd changed out of his casual work clothes into a black button-down and dark jeans that somehow managed to look both elegant and effortlessly cool. His hair was slightly damp, like he'd just showered, and he'd traded his professional camera for something smaller and more discreet. Thanks, I managed. Yeah, same. He grinned at my eloquent response. I wanted to grab some candid shots of the reception before people get too drunk to look natural. Hope you don't mind me lurking around with the camera. It's your job, I said, then immediately wondered if that sounded dismissive. I mean, the photos from this afternoon were incredible. Emma's going to love them. I hope so. She's been great to work with. Very clear about what she wanted, but also open to letting moments happen naturally. He paused, his eyes scanning the reception area with professional assessment. Speaking of which, I should probably get to work, but maybe we can talk later, when I'm off duty. The suggestion hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. I nodded, not trusting my voice to come out steady. I'd like that. Good. His smile was warm, genuine, and just a little uncertain, like he wasn't entirely sure what he was asking for, but was glad I'd said yes anyway. Save me a dance? Before I could point out that I was a terrible dancer, he'd already melted back into the crowd, camera in hand, moving through the reception with the same unobtrusive grace I'd observed that morning. The next few hours passed in a blur of wedding reception activities that felt both familiar and strange. I made conversation with relatives I hadn't seen in years, posed for family photos, and watched Emma and David navigate their first dance with a kind of joy that made everyone around them smile involuntarily. Through it all, I found myself tracking Daniel's movement through the crowd. He was everywhere and nowhere, capturing moments I didn't even realize were happening. The way my father's face softened when he looked at Emma, the concentrated delight on a flower girl's face as she carefully ate a piece of cake, the quiet moment when my mother finally sat down and allowed herself to enjoy what she'd created. Occasionally, our eyes would meet across the reception area, and he'd smile or nod before returning to his work. But I could feel his attention like a warm current running beneath the evening's events, a constant awareness that made me hyper-conscious of my own movements and expressions. It was nearly 10 o'clock when I finally escaped to the bar that had been set up near the garden gate. The night air was cooler than the afternoon had been, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of music from inside the tent. I ordered a whiskey, something stronger than the wine I'd been nursing all evening, and found myself a quiet spot where I could observe the reception without being drawn into conversation. Hiding? Daniel's voice came from beside me, and I realized he'd approached without my noticing. His camera was nowhere to be seen, and he looked more relaxed than I'd seen him all day. Taking a break, I said. Wedding receptions are exhausting when you're an introvert. Tell me about it. Though I usually have the camera as a buffer, gives me something to do with my hands, a reason to observe instead of participate. He gestured toward the bartender. Whiskey, neat, please. We stood side by side at the bar, watching the reception continue without us. The tent was full of people I'd grown up with, family friends, my parents' neighbors, Emma's college roommates who'd driven down for the weekend. It should have felt comfortable, familiar, but instead I felt like an observer at my own sister's wedding. You okay? Daniel asked quietly. You look a little overwhelmed. I was surprised by how easily he'd read my mood, how accurately he'd identified something I was barely aware of myself. I'm fine, it's just a lot, being home, seeing everyone, trying to be the version of myself they remember. And what version is that? I'm not sure anymore. The dutiful son, maybe? The one who calls home regularly and visits for holidays and fits into the shape they expect. I took a sip of whiskey, feeling it burn warm down my throat. I used to know how to do that. Now it feels like trying on clothes that don't quite fit. Daniel nodded like he understood something about ill-fitting roles. How long has it been since you felt comfortable here? Years. Maybe since college, when I started to figure out who I actually was instead of who everyone wanted me to be. The admission surprised me with its honesty. I wasn't usually so forthcoming with strangers, especially about family dynamics I barely understood myself. That's hard, he said simply, feeling like you have to choose between being yourself and belonging somewhere. There was something in his tone that suggested he spoke from experience. I glanced at him sideways, noting the thoughtful expression on his face as he watched the reception continue without us. Is that why you became a photographer? I asked. So you could observe instead of participate? He considered the question, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Maybe partly. There's something safe about being behind the camera. You're present but separate, involved but protected. He paused, then added more quietly, though sometimes you see something through the lens that makes you want to put the camera down. The comment sent heat spreading through my chest. There was something about the way he'd said it, personal, intimate, like a confession meant specifically for me. Like what? I asked, though I wasn't sure I was ready for the answer. He turned to face me fully, his dark eyes serious in the soft light from the string lights overhead. Like someone being genuinely themselves without realizing how rare that is. Someone who doesn't perform or hide or try to control how they're seen. He took a sip of his whiskey, never breaking eye contact. Someone who makes you remember why you started taking pictures in the first place, to capture beauty, truth, moments that matter. The words hung between us like a bridge neither of us was sure we should cross. I felt exposed, seen in a way that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't. Instead, it felt like recognition, like someone had finally looked at me and understood something essential I'd never been able to articulate myself. I should probably get back, I said, though I made no move to leave. Probably, he agreed, also staying exactly where he was. We stood there in silence, watching the reception continue around us. The band had switched to slower songs, and couples were swaying together on the small dance floor that had been set up in front of the tent. Emma and David were in the center, lost in each other in the way that made everyone else invisible. They look happy, Daniel observed. They are. Emma's always been good at knowing what she wants and going after it. I watched my sister rest her head on her new husband's shoulder, completely at peace in a way I envied. I've never been like that. I tend to overthink everything until I talk myself out of taking risks. What kind of risks? The question was casual, but something in his tone suggested he was asking about more than just general life philosophy. I felt the weight of the evening, the whiskey, the strange intimacy of standing apart from the celebration with someone who felt increasingly like a co-conspirator rather than a stranger. The kind that might matter, I said finally. The kind that might change things. He nodded like he understood. Those are the scariest ones. And the most worthwhile, according to Emma. Smart sister. She has her moments. We fell into comfortable silence again, but it felt different now, charged with possibility, with the awareness that we were having a conversation about more than wedding receptions and life philosophy. The space between us seemed both too small and too large, like we were magnets held at just the right distance to feel the pull without quite touching. Dance with me? The request surprised us both, I think. Daniel looked as startled as I felt, like the words had come out without his permission. I'm not a good dancer, I warned. Neither am I. We'll figure it out. He set his glass on the bar and extended his hand, palm up, waiting. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. The choice to say yes or no, to step closer to whatever was happening between us or retreat to the safety of polite distance. I took his hand. He led me to a quiet corner of the dance floor, away from the main crowd but still within the warm glow of the string lights. The band was playing something slow and jazzy, the kind of song that was meant for quiet conversation and gentle swaying rather than actual dancing. Daniel's hand settled on my lower back, warm and sure through the fabric of my shirt. I rested my free hand on his shoulder, hyper-aware of the solid warmth of him, the way he smelled like cologne and something else I couldn't identify, something that made me want to step closer. We moved together slowly, barely dancing so much as swaying in place. He was right. Neither of us was particularly graceful, but somehow that made it easier. There was no performance, no attempt to impress, just two people moving together in the soft darkness, finding a rhythm that worked. This is nice, he said quietly, his voice close to my ear. Yeah, it is. I let my eyes drift closed, focusing on the sensation of movement, the warmth of his body near mine, the gentle pressure of his hand on my back. When was the last time I'd slow danced with someone? High school prom, maybe, which felt like a lifetime ago and had been nothing like this. Nothing like the easy intimacy of moving with someone who felt like they understood something essential about who I was. Marcus? His voice was softer now, more uncertain. I opened my eyes to find him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, want maybe, mixed with something that looked like surprise. Yeah? I'm glad I met you this weekend. The simple statement hit harder than more elaborate declarations might have. There was something honest and immediate about it, like he'd surprised himself by feeling it. Me too, I said, and meant it completely. We continued swaying together, the music washing over us, the reception continuing around us, but somehow separate from us. I was acutely aware of every point of contact, his hand on my back, my hand on his shoulder, the small space between our bodies that seemed to shrink with each movement. When the song ended, we didn't immediately step apart. Instead, we stood there holding each other, caught in the space between one moment and the next, neither of us quite ready to break the connection. I should probably, Daniel began, but didn't finish the sentence. Yeah, I agreed. Though I wasn't sure what we were agreeing to, finally, reluctantly, we separated. But something had shifted between us during those few minutes of dancing. Some barrier had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The awareness of each other that had been building all day had crystallized into something more tangible, more urgent. "I need to get a few more shots," he said, though his eyes never left mine. "But maybe later, when things wind down? I'd like that." He smiled, the expression soft and a little uncertain. "Good." I watched him walk back toward the reception, noting the way he moved with renewed purpose, like the decision to see each other later had given him something to work toward. Then I headed inside the tent, trying to look like someone who had simply stepped outside for air rather than someone whose entire evening had just shifted on its axis. The next hour passed slowly. I made conversation with aunts and uncles, helped my mother with small hosting duties, and tried to look like I was paying attention to the speeches and toasts. But my awareness kept drifting to Daniel, tracking his movement through the crowd, noting when he paused to change camera settings or when he smiled at something someone said. Occasionally, our eyes would meet across the reception area, and each time I felt that same flutter of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. What exactly were we planning to do when the reception wound down? Talk, walk, something more? The not knowing was both thrilling and terrifying. Around 11:30, the band announced their last song. The crowd had thinned considerably. Elderly relatives had already said their goodbyes, and families with small children had retreated to hotel rooms or spare bedrooms. What remained were mostly Emma's friends and a few family members who weren't ready for the evening to end. I helped my parents and the caterers start the initial cleanup, stacking chairs and collecting abandoned wine glasses, while Emma and David made their rounds, thanking everyone for coming. Daniel continued to work, capturing the golden hour moments as the reception transitioned from celebration to memory. It was nearly midnight when the last of the non-family guests finally departed. Emma and David had long since escaped upstairs, exhausted and blissful. My parents were coordinating with the catering staff about final cleanup, leaving me to handle the smaller details like collecting programs and making sure nothing important had been left behind. I was gathering wine glasses from around the garden when Daniel appeared beside me, his camera finally put away. "Need help?" "I think we've got it mostly under control," I said, straightening up with an armful of glasses. "How did the photos turn out?" "Really well. Some beautiful moments tonight. Your sister's going to be thrilled." He paused, looking around the garden that was slowly being returned to its normal state. "It's sad, isn't it? How quickly something so beautiful becomes just a memory." "That's what the photos are for, right? To make the memories last?" "True, though photos can only capture so much." He was looking at me when he said it, and something in his expression made my pulse quicken. "Some things you just have to experience in the moment." The comment hung between us, loaded with possibility and invitation. I set the wine glasses down on a nearby table, suddenly less concerned with cleanup duties. Are you finished for the night?" "Officially, yeah. My job here is done." He smiled, but there was something nervous in his expression, though I should probably start loading my equipment into the car. "Do you need help?" "I'd appreciate it, actually. Some of the lighting gear is pretty heavy." It was a reasonable request, the kind of practical offer anyone might make. But as we walked toward the garden gate where his car was parked, I felt like we were crossing another invisible threshold, moving from the public space of the reception to something more private, more intimate. His car was parked in the small lot beside the house, away from the main reception area. The music from the band had stopped, but I could still hear distant voices as the cleanup continued. Daniel's equipment was neatly arranged near his trunk: camera bags, lighting stands, reflectors, and other gear I couldn't identify. "Just grab one of those light stands," he said, lifting a heavy bag. "Careful, they're heavier than they look." We worked in companionable silence, loading his equipment into the trunk with a kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd done this countless times. The night air was cool and quiet, carrying the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of cleanup activity. It was as we were loading the last of his gear that he said it, his voice soft in the darkness. "You know I took more pictures of you than anyone else today, right?" The words stopped me mid-motion, one hand still resting on the lip of his open trunk. I turned to face him, my heart suddenly beating faster. Why? The question came out more breathless than I'd intended, but I didn't try to hide it. There was something about the darkness, the quiet intimacy of the parking lot that made pretense feel impossible. Daniel didn't look away. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that I could see the reflection of the distant string lights in his eyes. Because every time I looked through the camera lens today, you were the person I wanted to photograph. During the ceremony, during the reception, even when you weren't doing anything particularly interesting. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. I've been a photographer for 10 years, Marcus. I've shot hundreds of weddings, and I've never had that happen before, never had someone just draw my attention like that over and over. His honesty was devastating, beautiful, terrifying. I felt exposed and seen and understood in a way that should have made me want to run, but instead made me want to step closer. I don't understand, I said quietly. What is it you see? Authenticity, he said immediately. You don't perform for the camera, don't try to control how you're perceived. You just exist, completely yourself, and that's… He trailed off, shaking his head slightly. Do you know how rare that is? Most people spend so much energy managing their image that they forget how to just be present. But you're just present, always. It's beautiful. We were standing very close now, the open trunk creating a small private space between his car and the hedge that bordered the parking area. The distant sounds of cleanup seemed very far away, like we existed in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. I kept thinking I was imagining it, I admitted. The way you looked at me today, the way it felt like you were really seeing me. You weren't imagining it. His voice was soft, intimate in the darkness. I was seeing you. I couldn't help it. Something in his tone made my breath catch. There was want there, barely restrained, and something deeper, recognition, connection, the acknowledgement of something that had been building between us all day. Daniel, I know, he said quickly. I know this is crazy. We just met yesterday. You're here for your sister's wedding. I'm here to work. Tomorrow you'll go back to Seattle and I'll go back to Charlotte and this will just be… He gestured helplessly. But I can't pretend I don't feel it. Whatever this is. I feel it too, I said, the admission coming out in a rush. I've been thinking about you all day, about the way you looked at me through the camera, about what it meant, about whether I was reading too much into every interaction. You weren't reading too much into anything. He stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. If anything, you were probably reading too little. The comment sent heat flooding through me. We were standing so close now that I had to tilt my head back slightly to maintain eye contact, could see the way the distant lights caught the gold flecks in his dark eyes. What are you saying? Instead of answering with words, he reached up and brushed a strand of hair away from my forehead. It was such a simple gesture, barely a touch, but it felt electric. His fingers lingered against my skin for just a moment longer than necessary before dropping to adjust my collar, another excuse to touch, to close the distance between us just a little more. I'm saying, he said quietly, his hand still resting against my chest, that I haven't felt this kind of connection with someone in a very long time, maybe ever. And I know it's complicated and I know the timing is terrible, but I don't want to pretend it's not happening. My heart was beating so hard I was sure he could feel it through my shirt. The weight of his hand against my chest, the warmth in his voice, the way he was looking at me like I was something precious and unexpected. It was overwhelming and perfect and terrifying all at once. I don't want to pretend either, I said. We stood there for a moment, caught in that space between admission and action, both of us aware that we were standing at the edge of something that would change everything. The silence stretched between us, charged with possibility and want, and the kind of nervous anticipation that comes with recognizing something important is about to happen. Daniel's free hand came up to cup my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly across my cheekbone. The touch was gentle, questioning, giving me every opportunity to pull away. Instead, I leaned into it, my eyes drifting closed at the simple intimacy of being touched with such careful tenderness. Marcus, he whispered, and my name in his voice sounded like a prayer, like a promise, like a question all at once. I opened my eyes to find him looking at me with an expression that was equal parts want and uncertainty, like he was asking permission for something we both wanted but weren't sure we should take. The space between us seemed to shrink without either of us moving. I could feel his breath on my lips, could see every detail of his face in the soft light filtering through the hedge. This was it. The moment when everything would change, when whatever was building between us would become something concrete and irreversible. "Hey, Marcus, you out here?" Emma's voice carried across the parking lot, bright and cheerful and absolutely devastating in its timing. We sprang apart like teenagers caught making out, both of us breathing hard, the spell broken so abruptly it left me feeling dizzy. "Yeah," I called back, my voice rougher than I intended. "Just helping load equipment." "Oh, good, you found Daniel." She appeared at the edge of the parking lot, still in her wedding dress, but with her hair slightly mussed and her makeup softened by hours of celebration. "I wanted to thank you again for everything. The photos today were incredible." "It was my pleasure," Daniel said, and his voice was perfectly professional despite the fact that 30 seconds ago he'd been about to kiss me. "Your wedding was beautiful. You should have the full gallery ready in about a week." "Perfect. And Marcus, Mom wants to know if you're planning to stick around tomorrow or if you need to head back to Seattle." The practical question felt surreal after the intensity of the past few minutes. I tried to refocus on normal conversation, on being Emma's brother rather than someone who had just been on the verge of kissing a man in a parking lot. "I fly out tomorrow afternoon," I said, "but I'll be around for breakfast, help with any final cleanup." "Great. Well, I'll let you finish up here. Daniel, seriously, thank you again. I can't wait to see everything." She headed back toward the house, leaving us alone again in the parking lot. But the moment was gone, the spell broken by the reminder of real life, of the fact that tomorrow I would get on a plane and Daniel would drive back to Charlotte, and whatever was happening between us would become just a memory. Daniel closed his trunk with a soft thud, the sound somehow final. "I should probably head back to my hotel," he said, though he made no move toward the driver's side door. "Yeah, I should get inside. Help with cleanup." We stood there for another moment, both of us reluctant to end the conversation, to acknowledge that the evening was over. The interruption had broken the immediate tension, but it hadn't erased what had been building between us all day. "Marcus," Daniel said finally, "what happened tonight? What almost happened? I know. I want you to know it wasn't just the wedding or the atmosphere or—" He ran a hand through his hair, looking frustrated with his inability to find the right words. "This isn't something I do, get involved with clients' families or feel this kind of connection with someone I just met, but with you, with me? With you, it feels like something I should pay attention to, something worth exploring if circumstances were different." The comment was both hopeful and heartbreaking. If circumstances were different, if we lived in the same city, if we'd met under different conditions, if there were time to figure out what this connection might become. "Maybe they will be different," I said quietly. "Someday." He smiled, and there was something in his expression that looked like a promise. "Maybe they will." He moved toward the driver's side of his car, then paused with his hand on the door handle. "For what it's worth," he said, looking back at me across the roof of the car, "today was one of the best days I've had in a very long time, and not just because of the work." Before I could respond, he got in the car and started the engine. I stood in the parking lot watching his taillights disappear down the quiet street, my heart still beating faster than normal, my skin still warm where he touched me. When I finally walked back toward the house, I could see the reception area being efficiently dismantled by the catering staff. The string lights were still on, creating pools of warm light in the garden, but the tables were being cleared and the tent was being broken down. By tomorrow afternoon, it would look like the wedding had never happened. But as I stood in the doorway looking out at the space where Emma and David had gotten married, where Daniel and I had danced, where something important had begun and remained unfinished, I knew that some things couldn't be dismantled so easily. Emma found me there a few minutes later, having changed out of her wedding dress and into jeans and a t-shirt. "Good day?" she asked, settling beside me on the doorstep. Yeah, really good. You? Perfect. Absolutely perfect. She was quiet for a moment, then added, Daniel seems nice. He is. And? I looked at her sideways. And what? And I saw the way you two were looking at each other tonight, the way you danced together, the way you both disappeared at the same time and came back looking like you'd been having some very interesting conversations. Heat flooded my cheeks. It's not, it's complicated. The best things usually are. She bumped my shoulder with hers. But that doesn't mean they're not worth pursuing. He lives in Charlotte. I live in Seattle. We met yesterday. So? So those are pretty significant obstacles. Or they're just logistics. She stood up, stretching like someone who had just survived one of the most important days of her life. Marcus, you've spent the last few years building a life that looks perfect from the outside but doesn't seem to make you particularly happy. Maybe it's time to take a risk on something that might actually matter. Before I could argue with her assessment, accurate though it might be, she kissed my cheek and headed inside. Get some sleep, she said, and think about what I said. I sat on the doorstep for a long time after she left, watching the cleanup continue in the garden, thinking about Daniel's hands adjusting my posture yesterday afternoon, about the way he'd looked at me through the camera lens, about the moment in the parking lot when everything had felt possible until reality intervened. Emma was right about one thing. I had spent the last few years building a life that looked successful but felt empty. 60-hour weeks, a nice apartment I barely spent time in, colleagues I respected but didn't particularly like, a dating life that consisted of occasional dinners with men who were perfectly nice but who never made me feel the way Daniel had made me feel in the space of 2 days. What would it look like to take a risk on something that mattered? To acknowledge that the connection I'd felt with Daniel was real and rare and worth exploring, even if it meant complicating my carefully organized life. I was still thinking about it when I finally went inside and climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom. Through my window, I could see the garden where the last of the cleanup was finishing, where string lights still twinkled in the oak trees like stars that had gotten lost on their way to the sky. Tomorrow, I would fly back to Seattle, back to my job and my apartment, and my orderly, predictable life. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt like I had something to think about besides work deadlines and quarterly reviews. Tonight, I felt like I had glimpsed a different version of my life, one that included the possibility of connection, of being seen and understood by someone who made me want to be present, rather than constantly planning for the future. It was a dangerous feeling, hopeful and terrifying in equal measure. But as I finally fell asleep to the sound of distant voices and the gentle rustle of leaves outside my window, I realized I didn't want to let it go. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with the kind of humid heaviness that suggested afternoon thunderstorms. I woke early, my internal clock still programmed for Pacific time, and lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house waking up around me. My parents were already moving around downstairs, my mother's voice drifting up through the floorboards as she coordinated the final cleanup efforts. Emma and David had apparently decided to sleep in, understandable, given that they'd been the center of attention until well past midnight. I showered and dressed, then headed downstairs to find my mother in full organizational mode, directing the removal of rental equipment with the same military precision she'd brought to the wedding preparation. "Morning, honey," she said, barely looking up from her clipboard. "Coffee's fresh. The caterers need the tables and chairs moved to the front yard for pickup, and someone needs to check the garden for any dishes or glassware that might have been left behind." "I'll take the garden," I offered, grateful for a task that would give me some quiet time to think. The garden looked different in the gray morning light, smaller, more ordinary, like a stage set after the performance had ended. The string lights were still up but turned off, creating delicate shadows among the oak branches. Most of the rental equipment had been removed, but there were still traces of the celebration scattered around. A forgotten wine glass near the rose trellis, a program that had blown under a bush, a boutonniere that had been dropped and forgotten. I was collecting these remnants when I heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the hedge, I could see Daniel's Honda Civic, and my heart did something complicated in my chest. Relief, anticipation, nervousness, all mixed together in a way that made it hard to breathe normally. He appeared at the garden gate a few minutes later, carrying a small camera bag and looking slightly uncertain. "Hi," he said. "I hope it's okay that I stopped by. I wanted to get a few shots of the space in different light for the complete story." "Of course," I said, though I suspected there was more to his visit than professional photography. "Mom's coordinating cleanup inside if you need to talk to her." "Actually, I was hoping to talk to you." The admission hung between us like a bridge neither of us was quite sure how to cross. In the daylight, with the wedding over and real life pressing in around the edges, the intensity of the previous night felt both more and less significant. "Okay," I said. "Talk." He set his camera bag down on one of the remaining tables and looked around the garden, seeming to gather his thoughts. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd expected. "I've been thinking about last night, about what happened between us, what didn't happen." He paused, looking at me directly. "I want you to know that it wasn't just wedding atmosphere or champagne or whatever. The way I feel about you, the connection I think we have, it's real." "I know," I said. "I feel it too." "Good, because I've been trying to figure out how to say this without sounding crazy." He took a breath, then continued. "I know you live in Seattle. I know I live in Charlotte. I know we just met 2 days ago and have no logical reason to think this could become anything more than a weekend connection. But I think it could be, if we wanted it to be, if we were both willing to take a risk on something that might be worth the complications." My heart was beating faster again, the same way it had in the parking lot when he'd almost kissed me. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that maybe distance doesn't have to be the end of the conversation. Maybe we could stay in touch, see where this goes. I travel for work sometimes. I could come to Seattle. You could come to Charlotte." He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly vulnerable. "I'm suggesting that maybe we don't have to let this end just because the wedding is over." It was exactly what I'd been thinking about all night, but hearing him say it out loud made it feel both more possible and more terrifying. He was talking about rearranging our lives, about taking a chance on something that existed more in potential than in reality. "You don't think it's crazy?" I asked. "Trying to build something with someone you barely know?" "Maybe a little crazy," he admitted with a smile. "But I've spent the last 5 years playing it safe, dating people who made sense on paper but never made me feel anything close to what I felt yesterday when you laughed at something I said. Sometimes crazy is the only option that makes sense." Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced at it automatically, seeing a reminder about my flight that